Now we've reached the exciting part where we can load our quilt to the frame. Now the amazing thing about this frame is that although it's only 5 feet long, this frame can quilt from a small block or crib size quilt to as large as a king size quilt. Let me show you how. Included with your 5-foot frame, you will find a variety of clamps that will help you navigate your quilt as you load and shift. The first clamp is the Deluxe Quilt Clamp. Then it's followed by 6 easy grasp quilt clamps, 3 large quilt clamps, and 3 small quilt clamps. When we load our quilt, well, before we load our quilt, it's important to make a quilt sandwich. Now, a quilt sandwich is composed of 3 different layers. The first layer is your quilt top, which is the quilt that you've spent a lot of time piecing, followed by the batting, which is the fuzzy part, and ending with the backing, which is the back fabric. These 3 pieces are sandwiched together using either an adhesive spray, and there are many different types of adhesive sprays, to pinning down the sandwich, or even some people choose to hand baste the sandwich quilt. Now make sure that along the edges of your quilt sandwich you have at least 6 inches that are just the batting and the backing. The reason why that's very important is that that's what will anchor your quilt sandwich to the frame. As you move along, the way to position the quilt sandwich depends on the limits of the machine. So for example, when you push the machine back, you see that it stops right here. This is the limit of where we can start. In pushing the machine all the way to the left, we see where we can start sewing on the left-hand side. And so it's important in positioning my quilt top, in particular the quilt sandwich, so that I know where I can start sewing and where the machine will allow me to begin sewing. So now that we have our quilt positioned correctly, let's make sure we clamp it down. The best way to install the Deluxe Quilt Clamp is to open up one side and slowly build and squeeze it into place. The easy grasp quilt clamps can go anywhere you see that you need some tension to hold down your quilt. Now it's recommended that you put one on the far left-hand side because that's typically what will be your foundation clamp as you shift and transition to quilt different parts of your quilt. Now let's talk a little bit about advancing the quilt. Because my quilt is larger than the frame, I need to move it and advance it so I can keep quilting. The best way to do that is remove the clamps that are along the edges. And the best place to put these as you're shifting is right here on these nifty clamp holders, otherwise known as the handles to the machine. I am going to remove all of the clamps except this one. And the reason why I don't want to remove that one is because that's going to anchor my, my quilt to the frame. And it just helps to keep it in place. I'm going to grab the clamp and slowly shift my quilt over little by little. Now because this is a big quilt, often it just takes a little bit of time to shift it over. Once I see that my quilt is in place, I then take the clamps and I clamp it back into place. Now I'm ready to finish quilting the other side of my queen size quilt. Now I'm ready to quilt the other side of my large quilt. Now we're going to talk about advancing our quilt. When we're setting our clamp as we advance our quilt, it's important to keep in mind that this left upper hand clamp is the one that sets the rhythm, if you will, of the rest of the quilt. In keeping an eye on this clamp on the left hand side, we then can make sure that the rest of the quilt is straight and equally proportioned out. It also sets the tension for the quilt on the rest of the frame. Now, as I've advanced my quilt, there's a lot of quilt that's left over. So what we do is, as we finish quilting and advancing our quilt, we roll up the segment that is already completed right along where the easy grasp quilt clamps are. Now, the reason why that's important is because when you take your large or small quilt clamp, these fit perfectly onto the easy grasp clamps. So the rubber part really keeps it nice and firmly into place, so that as you are progressing your quilt and finishing it up, these quilt clamps will hold your quilt in place so that you can have a smooth quilting experience. And they work together as a system. Once I have rolled up my quilt, I can then easily move my machine to continue quilting as I've advanced forward. One important thing to remember on this frame is that the quilt never goes underneath this pole. You'll find there's a little happy face that indicates locked and open. Once it's locked, it should remain locked. And the small space that's underneath the pole is just enough so that the machine can run smooth and glide underneath it. So again, we never put any of the quilt underneath the pole. It remains constantly on top using the clamps.